The topics and opinions expressed on the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4WN Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4WN Radio, its employees, or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4WN Radio.
This is Beyond Confidence with your host, Divya Parekh. Do you want to live a more fulfilling life? Do you want to live your legacy and achieve your personal, professional, and financial goals? Well, coming up on Divya Parekh's Beyond Confidence, you will hear real stories of leaders, entrepreneurs, and achievers who have stepped into discomfort, shattered their status quo, and are living the life they want. You will learn how relationships are the key to achieving your aspirations and financial goals. Moving your career or business forward does not have to happen at the expense of your personal or family life, or vice versa. Learn more at www.divyaparekh.com, and you can connect with Divya at contact@divyaparekh.com. This is Beyond Confidence, and now here's your host, Divya Parekh.
Good morning, listeners. This is Divya, and so thrilled to be here with you because I get to spend time with you. So I want to thank each and every one of you who have got our books, whether it is The Entrepreneur's Garden that can help you build relationships with yourself, time, money, and a whole lot more important things that can change your life, or Expert to Influencer that can help you become an influencer, just not with likes or followers, an influencer that creates impact and brings fulfillment to your life. And the best part is that the partial profits from the books go to entrepreneurs all across the globe from kiva.org. And keep the kindness circle going. Find that 1 hour of your time and help someone, whether it's your neighbor, your family, or a stranger, without any strings attached. Let's bring our guest on. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here today.
Absolutely. So let's begin at the beginning. Do you recall a moment from your childhood that still stands out for you today?
Yes, I do actually. When I was a youngster, my father was in the Navy and he was stationed in Turkey. So we grew up in a small Turkish village called Diamandire, and I used to speak almost as fluent Turkish as I did English. And we actually had a neighbor come by and bring over this small animal in the palm of his hand. We didn't know what this animal was. And so we took it in, and it turns out that it was a baby bear. So we actually wound up raising a baby bear, started with an eyedropper, and then my father was feeding this bear when it got bigger to the size of a small dog with 6 milk bottles, and chased us around the yard and slid down the slide, tried to swing on the swing, not very well. But that really were some of my first memories with my brother, the baby bear, playing with my sister and I in the backyard.
Wow, that's fantastic. And of course, I'm sure the question that's on everyone's mind is that what happened to the baby bear?
We actually had the baby bear for a number of years while we were in Turkey and had just a wonderful time. We had to move, and so we wound up giving the bear to a wonderful organization. It's like a small zoo in Istanbul. And from what I understand, the name of the bear was Scratchy. Name is Scratchy. He had a long and wonderful life at with this incredible organization there. So it turned out great.
Well, what a lovely story. So from what I'm hearing is that you moved from base to base, that your dad was in Army or?
He was a naval officer, worked for naval security. So our next stop after Turkey was Washington, D.C. area. in Baltimore, Maryland, and he worked for the naval security
Mm.
group
Well,
there.
I want to thank you for your dad's services. Now, question for you, like, as you moved from town to town, it can be seen as an adventure, and at the same token, it can be very hard for kids to form friends. And it almost seems like you have formed friends and you're about to leave again.
That is true. It was difficult, but I did have some wonderful and close friendships while I was growing up that I recall, and have even kept in touch with a few of them. But that was the difficult part, is getting to know new people, a new school, a new area every few years or so. Challenging.
Mm. So as you grew up, where did your interest take you?
Well, my father, as I mentioned, was in naval security, and I actually wrote about his adventures in my book, Red November. But while we were stationed near Washington, D.C., I was a very young tyke, so I actually don't really have very many memories of this. But the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded at that time.
Mm.
My father was working on a top secret project to find Soviet submarines. And he actually wound up being called to the White House to brief President Kennedy and the XCOM group at the time. Kennedy actually wound up using that information to back down Khrushchev. So I didn't even know about that until years later. But my father became an author and inspired me to become one. And that story didn't come out until many, many years later. He was forbidden to talk about it. But I finally pulled it out of him and wrote about it in Red November.
So did you want to be an author all of your life?
Almost all my life. I remember being a young boy. We then were stationed in San Diego, where I am now. And my father was getting his master's degree in history. And we actually got into a small Volkswagen and went out to the countryside up near an area called Temecula here, north of San Diego. We were looking for the old Butterfield stagecoach route because he wanted to prove that every historian had got it wrong. And we had a couple of cameras, and we went looking for the trail. Finally did find it. My father wrote about it. And so I remember I was in grade school at the time, and I wrote an article about it. I got an A+ on the article, and that kind of got me excited about maybe becoming an author.
Well, that's wonderful. So as you grew up, sounds like your father had a huge influence on your life. Here you are looking for history. And as you grow up, so did you go get education around writing? Tell us, like, were there any other pit stops till you became a full-time author?
Yeah. I actually thought I was going to become an engineer while I was in the Navy. I did go through technical school for submarines and learned a lot about electronics and technology, but at the time I also became a Navy diver. And so I was torn as to what I wanted to do when I got out, and I started looking at the technology and engineering career path, but decided that really wasn't me. So I instead went into marketing, of all things. And that's where my writing desire became even more pronounced. And I was doing, of course, quite a bit of writing for more of the business side, and kept that up throughout my career. But I decided to start writing books right about that time. My father was writing his memoir, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to write mine too. So we both had things we really couldn't talk about. They were top secret. But I decided to go ahead and write it, even though I'd probably never publish it.
Mm. So let's rewind a little bit. First of all, thank you to your family for being generational servicemen, and really appreciate your services. So tell us, a little bit about the time when you were a Navy diver, because that life is difficult. If you can share any stories, of course, share a couple of stories and what lessons and what impact did it leave on you?
I recall that my Navy diver training, we actually did this in Oahu, Hawaii. And typically, submarine divers go through a 4-week course. Mine was 6 weeks. The submarine course wasn't available, so I took the U.S. Marine course. Marine and Navy divers could go to courses together where it was needed, but there was an extra 2 weeks for the Marine course because it was more of a combat swimmer course for them. And so it was not only scuba, but also what was called dragger, which was a bubbleless breather. You wore it on the front, looked like a smashed vacuum cleaner that gave no bubbles for clandestine operations. But because of that, I also became involved in some operations as a diver that normally submarine divers wouldn't do, primarily because I also went to a photographic school. So I learned about 35 millimeter underwater cameras, also periscope cameras, 70 millimeter. And I became the photographer that took photographs of various different vessels and so forth through the periscopes, but also went on missions. Some of these were with SEAL Team 1. And Navy divers did this. In fact, another gentleman who was a Navy diver wrote a book called Just a Sailor. He wrote about that, going with SEAL teams. And we would do photographic missions. And so those were the things that I wish that I could have written about back then. I finally was able to do that in Red November and bring that out. But there was one operation that I wrote about in Red November where we actually ran into a tender at Diego Garcia, and there was a big shark out there, and I had to go on a shark watch. And that wasn't the fun part of being a diver, but submarine divers did do things. For example, if you were right off the coast of somewhere, you had to go out of the escape trunk hatch and maybe fix something so it wouldn't make noise, so you didn't have to leave station. You'd be a mile off the coast of quote unquote enemy waters. These are things that we couldn't talk about.
Of course.
Many decades after they occurred.
Right. And they say that Navy SEALs train the hardest. So did you train with them? And as part of being a Navy diver, did you have to go through the same training? And then it's pushed, and it again goes back to building your capacity as to how do they build their capacity from a mindset perspective while they're training for the physical, just pushing the limits.
Yes, the first phase of Navy SEAL training is similar to Navy diver training. It's more about your physical endurance. And I recall getting up very early. We would run for many miles, and then we would go through calisthenic exercises for hours, and then we would run back. And then we would be thrown into a pool with, at that time, they were called twin 90s. So divers today might use a 45 cubic inch single tank. We had two 90 cubic inch tanks, so we could stay underwater for an hour and a half or longer. We would be in a pool paired with a buddy and our instructors, and some of these were Navy SEALs, Navy divers, etc., who were part of our instruction team. They would harass us. They'd jump into the pool and they would pull the regulator out, twist it around, try to pull you away from your partner, pull your mask off, etc. And you would have to learn how not to panic. If you surfaced during that time, you would fail and you'd be kicked out of the school.
Oh, that is tough. So they're training you to remain calm under different scenarios.
That's correct. So we would be taught how not to panic because let's say we're doing an inspection on a submarine and we're down by a grate and someone lights off a pump, you could be sucked into that pump and your mask would be pulled off or your regulator pulled out, and you would have to know how to get out of that situation without panicking and drowning.
Mm.
And so we lost about 75% of our class during that training period. So that the first phase is similar. And then, of course, SEALs do things differently. They learn more about utilizing various weapon systems and working together in various team situations or whatever it is they're going to go do.
Right.
Our training was more on the job,
Mm-hmm.
working with various different units, etc. Actually out in the wild, so to speak. So somewhat less formal, and wasn't necessarily combat training with weapons, but it was learning how to do things in combat zones, reconnaissance and that sort of thing, photographic missions and so forth.
Absolutely. So how deep have you gone in the ocean?
Well, during the Cold War, and I again wrote about this in Red November, there were different types of diving. So you had scuba, you had dragger, which was the rebreather, and then you had what's called saturation diving. And that required various different training. I didn't do saturation diving. Mine was more dragger and scuba. And with scuba, I've been down to as deep as 240 feet.
Wow.
You've only got a couple of minutes, according to the dive at that depth. With a dragger, you can't go below 33 feet, which is 1 atmosphere, so maybe 30 feet at the most. But your missions are different. You're more stealth. You are trying not to have any bubbles.
Right.
I did have the privilege of interviewing some of the saturation divers. And I'm the only one who's ever had any interviews with saturation divers. They wouldn't talk to anyone else, only someone who'd also been a diver. And even then, they were very cautious. But
it makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. And they did missions down to 1,000 feet deep using helium oxygen mix called HELOX. And their missions were to wiretap Soviet communication tables, Russian communication tables. The information we gained from those missions, most experts believe, hastened the end of the Cold War. So they're very the most decorated, most dangerous missions ever during the Cold War.
Well, thank you to each and every one of them. And so as you finished your Navy SEAL, you mentioned that, you had started writing. As your dad was writing, you wrote your memoir. And tell us your journey from there until now.
Well, actually, my father and I together wrote my first book called Crazy Ivan. And that was somewhat about my naval experience. And the way I was able to write that without getting into trouble, the first half of the book was nonfiction memoir that did not delve into anything that could be considered confidential. And so clearly in the second half of the book, I wrote that it was fictionalized, but perhaps based on actual events. But by making it fictionalized, I was able to publish it without having to go through heavy redaction. But many of the actual names and events and so forth were fictionalized. And so that's how I was able to do it. Later, after gag orders cleared and many years passed beyond that, I was able to publish Red November and actually come out with the true nonfiction stories about what had happened during those Cold War missions.
And And have you ever thought about taking your books and converting it into scripts for movies or?
My agent did actually work with me to provide some information and pitch those to the movie folks, but nothing yet so far. I
Well,
do.
it's a long journey. It's about trying, and there's no guaranteed outcome. It's just that as an author, I see that you have been writing profusely, and I see another book in your background, Start With Who. So tell us a little bit more about it, and it's about business and how that has interwoven into your life and into other businesses' life.
You bet. This book, Start With Who, is the sequel to another book, business book, an award-winning book called The 7 Secrets of Neuron Leadership that came out a few years back, published by Wiley. And through my career, years ago, I was a co-founder for what eventually became an Inc. 5000 consulting firm. And our clients were some blue chip companies like Cisco, HP, SAP, Visa, and so forth, as well as many small businesses. And learned quite a bit through that experience, heavily involved in the sales and marketing side, but also in the recruiting side, because we would need to recruit contractors, consultants, and have them become contractors, if you will, for these organizations. And so I got heavily involved in what was called neuromarketing for projects originally with Hewlett Packard, and got interested in neuroscience. That led to interviews with neuroscientists, PhD neuroscientists, and so on, and eventually led to getting a Harvard neuroscience certification so I could understand what they were trying to tell me. But I was fascinated by this because we were using neuroscience for marketing purposes for consumer, but nobody had done it for the business to business side, or for what we would term as recruiting or HR functions. And that led me to stepping away from the organization I was with and starting a startup called Remotely Me to bring this to market in a software platform. And this book is wonderful interviews with a number of leaders. The entrepreneurial operating system is used by about 170,000 companies worldwide, small businesses. And the visionaries or leaders of that organization, former and current Mike Payton, Mark O'Donnell, wrote the foreword to the book. And there are just some fabulous information presented about how to use the neuroscience, the storytelling, and even some of the ancient Aristotle persuasion model tactics, etc., bringing all this together and aligning that with the way salespeople are taught to sell, looking at what we've been taught in the past that needs to be updated and modernized.
Definitely. So let's say our listeners are listening. What strategies you can give them where they can use either Aristotle's, like, because I know his ethos, logos and pathos kind of goes so well with the marketing, but taking some neuromarketing techniques that help entrepreneurs to operate from a place of integrity.
Well, I think integrity is a great word to use, because here's what we now know, and this comes from many studies. Deloitte has done some of these, PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Gallup, of course. And what we're finding is that whether you are in sales or marketing, or whether you are in HR, there's a single word that you need to be focused on, and that word is called trust. It's the most critical word for you to remember and to utilize in your business. Here's why. 91% of customers buy on trust. Unfortunately, only about 3% of customers actually trust most businesses. So there's a big disconnect. 80% of employees don't trust employers. However, if we can flip this, Deloitte says if we can build high trust with our talent, our organizations, and our customers, we can drive 400% more business performance, 88% more customer loyalty, and almost 80% more productivity. So even if you hate people, you should find ways to have high trust organizations. Now, in my book, I talk about 10 key ways to build trust because we now know from neuroscience, trust is directly related to a brain chemical we all have called oxytocin. Mm-hmm. If it's high, we trust. If it's low, we don't. So if we can build trust with customers and employees, we can get them to love their jobs or love our company and products almost as much as they love their dogs.
Well, share us a few ways as to, for both, how can we build trust with employees as well as with our customers?
I'll share 3. And again, there are 10, actually more than that, but 10 key ones in the book. And one of them is challenge stress. So stress creates a chemical in our brain called cortisol. Now, long-term, that's a bad thing. You don't want that long-term. But short-term, in a minimal capacity, it increases our attention and it increases oxytocin. We begin to learn how to trust those on our team that are helping us to overcome challenges that increase the stress. So, for example, you could have a if you will, competition within your organization. Maybe you're trying to raise some funds for a charity and you're competing with each other on different teams. That can be fun, but it's also a little bit of stress that increases the oxytocin. And another way would be to ensure that you have true transparency, not trying to obfuscate or lie. And that's so important with customers as well as with your employees. Be open and honest. You don't have to be blatantly honest, but at least be honest with them. Tell them what you can and can't do, and also be truthful about what's going on in your organization. Now, the third one, you ready for this one? Here's the fun one. It's cheese. That's right. There are certain cheeses like a great manchego or an aged cheddar that have tyrosine crystals in them. Now, tyrosine is one of the amino acids found in oxytocin. So eating these types of cheese can increase oxytocin and therefore trust.
Yeah, no, definitely. So you have shared open communication for employees. Now, with customers, how do you go about? There are a lot of small to medium businesses, and there is so many marketing gurus out there. Oh, you got to do this. You got to be on 5 different platforms. You got to put out social media content every single day. And like every 2 months, the algorithms change. So in this confusing chaos, so many of my clients will say, this is too much to do. How can we keep up with it? What are some of the ways that businesses can connect and foster that trust with their potential customers?
There's a wonderful model, and it's called the persuasion model. It was actually invented by an ancient Greek guy who wore fancy bed sheets and threw wild toga parties. So if you guessed the name Leonardo DiCaprio, you are incorrect. It is actually Aristotle, and he invented the persuasion model. Now, back then, he was talking about a speaking model, being a speaker for audiences. But if you really study this, you find that he was a consummate salesperson in the way he approached this. And what he advised is that you have to have a triangle of persuasion. There are 3 key parts. He called it logos, ethos, pathos, which really refers to having three different types of arguments or three different types of ways to present your information: logical, emotional, and instinctual. Now, 2,000 years ago, he knew nothing about brain science, but the connection that I made in the Start With Who book is that we now know that there are three parts of our brain. It's called the triune brain neuroscience principle that are, guess what? Logical, emotional, instinctual, your neocortex, limbic system, and your reptilian complex. And so the same thing holds true. If you want to truly connect with customers and build trust, or truly connect with anyone to build trust, you need to balance your communication style so that it's logical, emotional, instinctual. You can't just, if you're a tech company, have all your speeds and feeds and talk all about you and all your accolades and all the awards you won and stuff. That's all about you. They need to be the hero of the story, and you need to have more of an emotional, instinctual impact. And in fact, the emotional, instinctual is more important because 90% of our decision making is more emotional, instinctual, and not logical. So you do need to balance, but keep in mind that the emotional, instinctual part of it is really how we're going to make our decisions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting that you brought it up, because that's what we were talking about before we started the show. And it's amazing that the principles have stayed the same. And now we are able to analyze it and decipher it to a degree. The key is that if we go back and look at what human beings want, how we connect with other human beings and bring in those relationship principles, doing right by others, being there to serve others. And so many times, even though you may forget, but if you keep that why are you doing what you're doing, the what and how will take care of itself. So as you have experienced, do you have any stories of your clients or someone to share how they went from not being able to navigate and using the principles to having a turnaround?
Well, I think you nailed it. So nothing against Simon Sinek at all. A groundbreaking concept that he came up with about a dozen years ago now. Start with why and go from why to how and then to what, whereas most organizations go the other way. They start with what and then they go to how and then they go to maybe why. So my book talks about how we need to now step into the future because of the neuroscience, bringing in the storytelling, resurrecting some of these ancient Aristotle persuasion model concepts, and start with who. It really is about who you are dealing with. And I'll give you a story. Right here in San Diego, actually, an organization that does, they're called Armor Polymers, and they actually do polymers, if you will, for coatings. So if you want to coat your garage or you want to coat your patio or maybe your business flooring, they would be the organization to go to. We needed to have our patio and outside walk areas coated. So I had him come out to do this, and we got to talking about what he's doing for marketing and so on, and don't normally get involved in this side too much. Most of my clients have been larger firms, but some startups, but he was just really in need of a lot of help. So I said, okay, let's see what we can do for you. And the first step was to create what we call a messaging guide. That's really what's important for everyone, whether you are an organization that's trying to sell something or you are an HR. Why HR? Recruiters are salespeople. They're trying to sell someone coming on board. You need a messaging guide as much as a salesperson needs a messaging guide. And it's really instructions on how we're going to communicate consistently and effectively. And it uses this persuasion model It uses the neuroscience, but it also uses storytelling, using play, act one, act two, act three. How are you going to communicate? And there are certain things going on in the brain in act one. We're looking to raise dopamine and oxytocin. And then in act two, cortisol, norepinephrine, and so on. There are certain colors, phrases, tones, approaches. Everything is vital to being able to properly persuade a customer. So
absolutely. So do you have a small framework that our listeners can take and start using from today?
You bet. So think in terms of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, that book, the movie, of course, and the 3-act play. And you have Dorothy in act one. She's comfortable, even though she's not really happy in her gray and dull Kansas. Something thrusts her into act two, the tornado. And then she has to overcome obstacles, begin to work with the Tin Man and so on, and fulfill her mission, defeat the witch, and then come home and deliver the magic elixir, which is the knowledge, and no place is like home. That's how your story needs to unfold in a business sense. Act one, emotional. It's about emotionally connecting with the emotional brain. And again, using the words and phrases and the tone, etc., to connect emotionally in act one. Then thrust your customer, your prospect, your candidate into act two. Raise the tension, raise the cortisol, concerns, fears, problems. Don't leave it there. What are the consequences of inaction? Second part of act two. Raise norepinephrine. You have to scare them somewhat. Then in act three, and that's the instinctual part of your brain, then in act three, you become more logical and only bring your logical facts into act three and wrap it all up with these speeds and feeds and ROI then, and show them why logically you have the best solutions or you are the best company for them.
Definitely. As a storyteller, I can definitely connect with what you're sharing, is that connecting with people at an emotional level, because as you mentioned earlier, people make the decisions based on emotions and then justify it logically later on. And again, as you have been talking about, building trust is always being transparent and operating from a place of integrity. It's not about being sneaky or being sleazy and conning anyone. It's about making sure that you have the right solution. And if you have the right solution for your potential customer, do share it, because you're making somebody's life better. So that's a great framework, Bill. So share with our listeners, where can they find you? Where can they find your books? How can they connect with you?
You bet. Very simple. W. Craig Reed, all one word, WCRAIGREED.com, wcraigreed.com, or remotelyme.com, remotelYme.com, remotelyme.com. Either of those will take you to the book and information about the frameworks and the way you can use them.
Oh, fantastic. Do you have any last words for our listeners?
Well, what I can say is that just yesterday, I became a grandfather for the first time.
Congratulations.
Very excited about that. And whatever we're doing in our business or professional life, always keep in mind that families come first. That's the most important thing. And when you're trying to recruit someone to your organization or sell them, that's probably what they're thinking. It's really about them and how you can help them. Make them the hero of the story and care about them. If you truly care about what they want, and I think you said it, it's not about trying to twist somebody or to manipulate. It's truly caring about who they are, and know that in their lives, their families probably come first. So what can you do to help them have a better life? How do your products and solutions help them? How does your company help them have a good work-life balance, for example? That's what's going to win their hearts and minds.
Mm-hmm. Very rightfully said. So thank you, Bill, for your services, and thank you for sharing your insights. And thank you, listeners, for being part of our show, because you are the soul of this family. And let us know how we can support you and serve you. And thank you, Juan, for making the show technically possible. So be well and take care. Until next time.
Thank you for being part of Beyond Confidence with your host, Divya Parekh. We hope you have learned more about how to start living the life you want. Each week on Beyond Confidence, you hear stories of real people who have experienced growth by overcoming their fears and building meaningful relationships. During Beyond Confidence, Divya Parekh shares what happened to her when she stepped out of her comfort zone to work directly with people across the globe. She not only coaches people how to form heart connections, but also transform relationships to mutually beneficial partnerships as they strive to live the life they want. If you are ready to live the life you want and leverage your strengths, learn more at www.divyaparekh.com. And you can connect with Divya at contact@divyaparekh.com. We look forward to you joining us next week.